Hello and welcome to my channel. Today's video is about how to adapt kneeling poses. So it isn't actually a practice video. It's for those of you either who are curious or who really struggle with kneeling down for various different reasons. Now we're going to cover 4 different simple adaptations that you can do with all sorts of things that you would have lying around at home. I'm going to show you it with yoga props, but I'm going to describe how you could easily use alternative household objects. And those 4 simple ways of adapting the yoga poses are going to cover pain in the feet, pain in the ankle, pain in the knee, and pain in the quadriceps and or hips. So those are the areas that we're going to cover. So very quickly, I'm just going to explain why kneeling is quite difficult for a lot of people. Some people, you can kneel straight on the floor, and I'm lucky enough that I can do that without any pain. But one of the reasons why it affects so many people is because there's loads of different joints involved in the process of kneeling. So if I turn sideways to sit on my feet, which is the most simple way of kneeling down, the first thing is there's a lot of pressure that goes through your feet. And if your foot doesn't do that pointing action easily, then you're going to feel all that pressure, and you particularly feel it across the bones at the toe end of your foot because they will take a lot of pressure. You may also feel strain in the ankle. The second place that is involved is obviously your knee, and although I've got black leggings on, hopefully you can see it's a very sharp turn of the knee. It's the sharpest it can go. The back of my calf is right against my thigh, so not only is the joint completely closed, but there's weight on it because I'm sat down. So that is one of the reasons why the knees don't like it if they're not able to make that shape. And then the next one is that when we come up here, the quadricep muscles often are quite tight, and they're being asked, they attach into the knee around here. This is not detailed anatomy, but basically they stretch here, and they are coming all the way around here, and they're being stretched up. So for some of you, you'll find it's an extremely strong quadricep stretch. And for some of you, you may find there's all sorts of these, more than one of them going on. And you'll find hopefully some relief in these alternatives. So number 1, I'm going to show you how you can relieve pain in the feet. And the very most simplest way to do this is to sit on something that's a little bit squashy. So basically, initially, you just spread that out. So I'm taking a blanket. I'm thinking you'll probably have a blanket at home. And I'm going to sit, I'm going to turn that the other way, because what I want to have is the whole of the parts of my body that are touching the floor, so the whole of my knees right to my feet, supported on the blanket. So I don't want any changes of level, because that might introduce other pain or other imbalances, wonkiness basically, and you don't want to do that. So first of all, if you find that your feet press into the floor and that is painful, then put a blanket underneath you, or you might practice on a soft surface at home and find that that's okay, and then in your yoga class you're on a hard surface like this and you find it is not comfortable. You can also, for less amounts of pain, you could have 2 layers of mats. So you can see secretly, I actually have 2 layers of mats there. So you could take a couple of mats if you have access to that. But I'm sure that you will have access to some form of blanket. Fold it neatly, make sure it covers the whole of the base of your body. The second thing you can do, which you can do instead of or as well as this, so I'm going to take that blanket away, but you could keep it there for all of these adaptations. The second thing you can do is to support underneath the ankle. So I'm rolling up this blanket, and this is a really thick blanket, so this is going to make a very generous roll, which some of you may need. Now this deals with the problem of not being able to point your toes. So what you do is you place your ankles on top of there, and can you see how now I don't need to be able to point my toes? My foot can flex a little bit, and then I can sit back down again. And instead of all, my feet are too wide, hang on a second. So now instead of all the weight pressing down on parts of my feet that aren't ready to spread out and stretch, my foot is in a more relaxed position, and so that feels more comfortable. Now this is a very thick blanket. As I said, it rolls up and it's quite thick. You need to use the thinnest roll, the smallest amount that you can practice comfortably with. Otherwise you're just propping yourself up and never actually allowing yourself the potential to extend. If you're working with an injury, it's slightly different because you don't necessarily want to exacerbate that injury. But if you're working with stiffness, you want to work not too far into the pain of the stiffness, but into it enough that you feel like your body has got some support but some ability to extend. So one prop you might want to use, thing number one you can do, roll the blanket a bit less. It might be that you find you roll your blankets up and they're not as thick. It's always the same. You just put that in the front of your ankles and you kneel. The other thing you can do is use a face cloth. So this is basic face cloth. I'm going to roll that up. We're going to use this again for something else in a minute. So if you don't have any face cloths in your house, you could use a towel, any fabric that you can roll. We often use face cloths and towels because they're thicker and they behave a little bit more predictably when they get rolled up, so they don't go lumpy, is what I mean. But you can see how that is so much thinner than that. It's like the baby brother version. So if you need some comfort, but not all the comfort, and believe me, even a tiny roll like that can make a difference. Now what I will say is I've just put that under one side. With such a tiny little roll, that's all right, but anything bigger than this, and you must support both sides evenly, even if only one side needs it. Otherwise, over time, you're going to develop a bit of a hitch and you could actually create other problems. So with a tiny, tiny roll, that's fine, use it on one side. But if anything thicker than this, then you need to support both feet, even if you only have the pain in one foot. If I was working with classic yoga equipment and I wanted something small, hadn't brought a face cloth to my yoga class, I would use one of these cotton classic yoga belts, and I would fold that up neatly, avoiding the buckle, which is what I'm just doing here. And then that would create me a small little platform that I could also put underneath my ankles. And if I wanted to be very detailed, I could remove kind of layer after layer as my feet stretch out more easily. So those are two things you can do to deal with pain from the feet and the ankles. Make everywhere softer so your bones don't press in so much, but then also support the ankle up a little bit so that you don't have to point the foot as much. Moving on to the knees themselves. Now there are two ways we can support the knees, and both of these will actually also influence the quadricep, the second one a little bit more than the first. So I'm going to assume that you're using whatever you need for your feet. So use whatever you need for your feet. And then, again, we're going to come back to this washcloth. Now, if you get pain inside the knee joint anywhere, then use a small washcloth. Place it right up behind the knee. So can you see how I'm holding both sides? I'll show you at a different angle in a moment. Holding both sides, pulling it right in there. I'm holding up as I bend my knee, so it might take a little bit of practice to get the technique right. Now I've got my knee bent, I can let go, I can feel it's basically wedged right up at the back of my knee. I'm just going to hold my ankle to make sure my knee stays closed, and then I can sit back down again. Okay, so that is with a washcloth, and essentially what that's doing is this sharp turn of the joint. It is gently insisting that some extra space stays in that turn, and that can avoid pain. Sometimes, in fact quite often, if I face you, you might find that you get pain in the inner or the outer knee only because of tightnesses on either side, or maybe there's a slight inherent twist in your knee, all sorts of reasons, but it's quite common to just have it on one side or the other. And if that's the case for you, I'm going to re-show this with a yoga belt, and the extra length is quite helpful. So I'm just going to make sure that buckle doesn't go in the way. I'm going to make it fairly thick with a yoga belt. So if one side or the other hurts more, be very careful with yourself. But you could encourage a little bit more space at this side or a little bit more space at that side by having just slightly more pressure of pulling on that side very carefully as you close the back of that knee and then go back down. So the other way to do it is to kneel up. You can see I'm kneeling up. I can get that into the back of my knee. I pull it forwards. I would then adjust one side or the other if I want to. If it hurts both sides, pull evenly on both sides. Sit back down there. And that, for a lot of people, will relieve some knee joint pain, okay? You can experiment with how thick you want to use. You can't go too crazy because you'll stop yourself from being able to sit down, but the next adjustment may well help you with that. So there's how to specifically address knee joint pain, one of the ways. So our last adjustment helps with all of these actually, and it's probably the simplest thing you can do. So when you're kneeling, instead of kneeling down on your feet, you kneel slightly higher. So you would take a cushion or a folded blanket, or if you're working with classic yoga equipment, you would take flat yoga blocks. So this time I'll show you with the classic yoga equipment first, and you place some blocks between your feet and your bottom. So you're still nice and solid and comfortable, but you haven't got that angle. Your quadriceps aren't pulled as much as they were before. There's still pressure through your feet, so you may still need your foot adjustment, but now there isn't as much strain on the quads or on the knee joint because this angle is much more open. The quads are not pulled down and back so far. So that's how it looks with yoga blocks. Of course, I could use just one. I could even use 3. Or there are for sale half yoga blocks, and with adjusting for knees, actually half yoga blocks are really, really useful. So if you do have a knee problem and you think, oh, 2's too much, 1's not enough, buy half a block. Or you could add in a blanket, 1 block and a blanket, for example. So a blanket, or this might be like a cushion off your sofa or off your bed, that is good. Whenever you use a folded blanket, make sure it is nice and neat and square and not rumpled. Same with using a cushion, just make sure it's nice and solid and neat, because otherwise it can be annoying and it can throw you off. Now, if you're doing a yoga pose, if you're doing a yoga pose where you have your feet apart, in those poses, in hero pose, classically, you sit down onto the floor, but that might be too far. So again, this method, let me show you with a yoga bolster, which is essentially is a big cushion. This method, you bring the floor up to you, and that's much more comfortable. So I hope you've enjoyed that fairly swift walkthrough of 4 key ways you can adjust and use props to make kneeling in yoga poses and kneeling generally in life much more accessible and much more possible if you're working with pain in any part of the lower body. If you'd like to support my channel and say thank you for this content, you can do so with a small donation at my Ko-fi page, the details of which are on screen now. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again soon. Goodbye.